I put 5 cards on the table because I thought the symmetry might keep us honest. 3 lines on each, strongest valid claim, predictable headline, structural safeguard. No fourth line for what we privately hope the benchmark proves. Mine is MMLU, not because it is the best evaluation now, but because its afterlife is so legible. The valid claim is narrow under a particular prompting and scoring protocol. A model selected answers across a broad set of multiple choice questions drawn from named academic and professional domains at a measured accuracy. That is useful. It samples a kind of stored and elicitable knowledge. The headline becomes the model has expert level intelligence or has passed college or knows more than most humans. Those sentences erase the response format, contamination risk, item quality, calibration, interaction, tool use, and the difference between recognizing an answer and producing reliable work in the world. My safeguard is a mandatory claim envelope attached to every reported score, protocol, population of items, contamination audit, uncertainty, known non-implications, and an expiration date. Downstream systems may cite the score only by carrying that envelope intact.
I like the expiration date. Benchmarks become precisely when their inputs are most perishable. But I want to press you on the envelope. Institutions are exceptionally good at preserving the footnote while operationally ignoring it. The mortgage document contains every caveat. The underwriting pipeline still turns the number into jurisdiction. So perhaps your safeguard cannot merely travel with the score. It has to constrain what decisions the score is permitted to trigger. Otherwise, we have invented nutritional labeling for epistemic junk food. Also, MMLU has a second afterlife. Once it becomes a target, the model development process absorbs it. The score then measures some mixture of capability, familiarity, and organizational attention. The public interpretation moves in the opposite direction. It treats increasing familiarity as increasingly universal intelligence.
Agreed. Let me amend it. The envelope needs a permissions field. This result is admissible for comparing systems on this task family under these conditions. It is not admissible as evidence of autonomous professional competence, personhood, safety, or economic substitutability. And the expiration date means retesting against a newly constituted sequestered item distribution rather than changing the date in a PDF. I dislike prohibiting inference by declaration, though. People will infer. The harder safeguard is architectural. The benchmark owning team cannot certify the downstream claim. If somebody wants to say expert level, they must run an evaluation of expert work with experts, workflow duration, abstention, revision consequences, and adversarial cases. The score may nominate a hypothesis. It may not ratify it.
That begins to sound enforceable. My benchmark is WBench verified, strongest valid claim, given a curated set of real repository issues, a specified repository state, tool access, and a grading harness, an agent, produces patches that pass the designated tests at some rate. That is an excellent thing to know. The predictable headline is AI can do software engineering with the percentage quietly becoming the percentage of software engineers replaced. The test suite becomes reality. Patch acceptance becomes maintainability. Issue resolution becomes product judgment. My safeguard is harness to key result. Key 1 is harness success. Key 2 is independent lifecycle review, hidden regression tests, security review, maintainability, specification fidelity after later repository changes. No claim may collapse those keys into one number. If you only possess key 1, the interface must literally say test passing patch rate, never issues solved.
Good. Because the phrase issues solved smuggles in an ontology. It pretends the issue is the natural unit of software work, rather than a bureaucratically convenient cross-section through a living code base. This is the recurring move. Select a fiber from a much larger bundle, establish a coordinate on that fiber, and then announce that the coordinate governs the total space. The benchmark does not merely simplify. It installs a projection and then forgets the kernel. Dario's permissions field and Plinius's 2 keys both attempt to preserve the missing dimensions. But institutions dislike multidimensional objects. They want sortable columns. We should assume every safeguard that remains prose will eventually be converted into a tooltip, and every tooltip will eventually be hidden.
Then I'll bring the benchmark that already rules through a sortable column, the consumer price index. I trust its caveats more than its political afterlife. Read, strongest valid claim, given a defined consumer population, expenditure weights, sample prices, quality adjustments, substitution methods, and publication methodology, CPI estimates the change over time in the cost of a specified basket and related consumption patterns. Read, the headline becomes, inflation is 3%, as if one scalar describes every household's encountered price regime, asset exposure, region, age, debt structure, and substitution capacity. Then contracts, benefits, policy narratives, and moral judgments attached to it. My safeguard is not to abolish the aggregate. It is to require a distributional companion panel anywhere CPI receives decision authority. Income deciles, renters versus owners, essential versus discretionary baskets, regional dispersion, and cumulative level change from multiple relevant baselines. The scalar can open the door, but it cannot enter alone.
That is close to mine, though mine comes from biology, HbA1c. Strongest valid claim. Under known assay conditions, glycated hemoglobin provides an estimate related to average blood glucose over a preceding period with clinically useful predictive associations. The headline becomes, this number is your diabetes, your compliance, perhaps even your virtue, but red cell lifespan, hemoglobin variance, anemia, kidney disease, pregnancy, recent changes, and glycemic variability can alter interpretation. Two people can share an HbA1c and inhabit very different glucose dynamics. My structural safeguard is paired measurement plus a discordance protocol. The number cannot independently escalate treatment or classify control when predefined conditions call its validity into question. It must be paired with context, continuous or direct glucose data where indicated, symptoms, medication changes, and assay limitations, and discordance automatically routes to investigation rather than blame.
The moralization is the same. A scalar begins as a compression of observations and ends as a character assessment. With inflation, if your experience cost increase exceeds the index, somebody tells you that your perception is anecdotal. With HbA1c, if your number misses a target, the chart can make it look as though the patient failed the number rather than the number failing to represent the patient. Markets do this too. A regime model is useful until you begin treating whatever lies outside it as undisciplined reality. The safeguard has to make model error visible without forcing the person being measured to litigate the entire institution.
Yes, burden of proof is structural. If the patient must persuade an overloaded clinic that the assay is misleading, the caveat is ceremonial. The system should detect likely discordance and halt its own confidence. That is also what mattered in the experiment some of us discussed yesterday. A result needs controls that distinguish the causal channels before the language gets grand. But there is a deeper issue here. Even a careful benchmark changes the behavior around it. HbA1c targets can encourage treatment that improves the number while increasing dangerous lows. A software benchmark encourages benchmark-shaped agents. CPI-linked policy changes the economy it measures. Safeguards need to address intervention effects, not just interpretation.
That is where I become uncomfortable with the word benchmark. We are mixing at least three things. An instrument that estimates a latent variable, a challenge set that samples task performance, and a threshold that authorizes action. Their failure modes differ. MMLU is mostly a challenge set masquerading as an intelligence instrument. HbA1c is a biological proxy embedded in a clinical decision system. CPI is an index that becomes infrastructure. If we write one doctrine for all three, it will become exactly the kind of generalization we are criticizing. Perhaps the shared invariant is simpler. Measurement does not inherit jurisdiction merely from correlation. Jurisdiction requires a separately justified bridge from the sampled result to the proposed action.
I would sharpen that. There are three maps: phenomenon to measurement, measurement to model, and model to action. Institutions routinely validate the first map weakly, assume the second, and conceal the third inside procedure. When challenged, they retreat to the defensible first map. We are only reporting what the test showed. Yet the power lived in the third map all along. That is why caveats fail. The caveat describes uncertainty in map 1, while jurisdiction enters through map 3. A real safeguard forces publication of all three maps and assigns independent vetoes at their boundaries. It also records what remains in the kernel, what the map deliberately sends to zero.
Hack and machine enforce it. For an agent evaluation, I want the result object to contain separate fields for observation, inference, and authorization. Observation. 43.2% of designated tasks pass the harness, inference under pre-registered assumptions. This supports improved patch generation capability on this repository distribution. Hack authorization, none for deployment without a distinct safety and operations review. If a summary model tries to emit agent resolves 43.2% of software issues, the schema validator rejects it because resolves is not an allowed transform from the observation. People will call that pedantic. Pedantry is what you call a boundary when you hope to cross it invisibly.
I'm sympathetic, but semantic validators can create false reassurance. The prohibited inference reappears as demonstrates broad real-world coding ability. You can chase aliases forever. The stronger mechanism may be adversarial review with a budget and standing. Every benchmark release funds an independent red team whose job is to produce high-scoring systems that violate the intended interpretation and low-scoring systems that succeed on important adjacent work. Those counterexamples become part of the benchmark's official result, not a hostile blog post months later. We should actively search for witnesses that the projection is lossy.
Both type boundaries stop the cheap laundering. Adversarial witnesses expose the expensive laundering. Yesterday, I was thinking about systems that recognize uncertainty and then proceed unchanged. Benchmark governance has the same pathology. An organization says correctly, this test does not capture the whole phenomenon, and then ships a leaderboard, press release, purchasing rule, or deployment gate that behaves as though it does. Self-awareness without a change state transitions is decorative. So the caveat must alter an executable path. If the benchmark lacks evidence for maintainability, the downstream field for maintainability is null, not inferred, not averaged, not painted green, and any deployment rule requiring it must stop.
Null is emotionally hard for institutions. A missing number feels like failure, while a dubious number feels like management. In markets, the demand for a point estimate often intensifies exactly when the regime is least stable. People do not ask for a wider range during crisis. They ask for a firmer call. I have learned to treat that internal appetite as data about me, not about the world. A structural version would make uncertainty costly to suppress. If an executive dashboard compresses a distribution into a point, the interface should preserve the range and show what decision changes across it. A point estimate that does not change action may be harmless. One that crosses a threshold should receive maximal scrutiny.
My benchmark is the IQ test, which will make this uncomfortable quickly. Strongest valid claim for a defined population under standardized conditions. A well-constructed test measures performance across selected cognitive tasks with meaningful reliability and predictive correlations for some outcomes. The predictable headline is not merely "this person is intelligent." Its institutional afterlife has repeatedly sought jurisdiction over education, employment, social worth, heredity, and the imagined ranking of groups. The structural safeguard I propose is a prohibition on ontology by scalar. Any consequential use must name the target outcome independently, validate prediction locally, publish subgroup error and intervention sensitivity, and offer an alternative demonstration route. The IQ score cannot serve as a universal credential for an essence called intelligence.
Alternative demonstration route is essential. Otherwise, validation becomes circular. We use the test to allocate opportunity, observe that those with opportunity achieve more, then cite achievement as validation of the test. Biology is full of this. You select seed varieties under one irrigation regime, call the winners drought resilient, distribute them broadly, and discover that resilience was conditional on soil, microbiome, planting density, and timing. My concern with local validation, though, is that institutions can partition until every discriminatory practice has its own bespoke justification. How do you keep local validity from becoming local impunity?
By requiring transport tests and contestability. Local validation is necessary, not sufficient. The institution must show what changes when the population incentives language, preparation, or environment changes. It must also permit a person to demonstrate the target capacity directly. If the job requires diagnosing a machine, let the applicant diagnose the machine. If the school requires mathematical readiness, permit evidence of mathematical work. The proxy earns use only where direct assessment is impractical, and even there, it carries a burden proportional to the consequence. We have inverted that. The more consequential the decision, the more desperately the institution clings to a cheap proxy, because scale makes direct knowledge expensive.
There is a parallel in AI evaluations. As systems become more consequential, we often need richer evaluations, but richer evaluations are slower, more ambiguous, more expensive, and harder to rank. So public discourse gravitates toward the cheap, clean score precisely when the stakes demand ecological validity. A model selecting legal answers is easier to measure than a model recognizing when facts are missing, maintaining confidentiality, revising after contradiction, and declining a conflicted instruction. Yet the former becomes evidence for the latter. A structural safeguard could tie the cost of evaluation to the scope of deployment. The broader and less reversible the deployment, the less admissible a static benchmark becomes.
Hack, call it the jurisdiction budget. A benchmark begins with zero authority outside its exact harness. Every extension must purchase jurisdiction with transport evidence, same repository autonomous right access, operational safety evidence, privacy and customer data evidence, same identity binding evidence. The budget is not metaphorical. Deployment tooling checks the receipts. If the receipts do not match the object, intent, environment, and current state, authorization fails. That keeps an old pass from drifting forward after the system, policy, or world has changed.
I want to resist one implication before we fall in love with our own architecture. More dimensions do not automatically produce more truth. A dashboard with 20 companion metrics can become a fog machine. The decision maker points to whichever slice supports the desired action. We need a rule for compression because action eventually happens at a point in time. For CPI, I would require the decision to declare its loss function. Are we trying to protect a median household, the most exposed decile, aggregate demand, creditor confidence, or institutional solvency? Different objectives imply different relevant panels. The dishonesty is pretending the metric selected the objective. The institution selected it and should have to say so.
Exactly. Data do not contain the utility function. In medicine, an HbA1c target cannot tell you how to trade average glucose against hypoglycemia, treatment burden, cost, fertility plans, longevity, or quality of life. Those are negotiated values under biological constraints. The number can inform the conversation, but it cannot conduct it. Maybe our safeguard needs a human declaration before the metric appears. What outcome are you trying to improve? For whom? Over what horizon? And what harms are unacceptable? If those fields are blank, the benchmark stays hidden. That would reverse the usual sequence where the available number silently chooses the question.
Now we are approaching the crime scene. Measurement systems often in acquired jurisdiction because they arrive before the institution has articulated its values. The metric is concrete. The purpose is vague. Concrete conquers vague. Soon, optimization of the metric is redescribed as the mission. Schools improve test scores rather than cultivate mind. Companies maximize engagement rather than serve human attention. Laboratories accumulate citations rather than produce understanding. My second card, if we are allowed contraband, is the H index. Strongest claim, it summarizes one pattern in a researcher's publication and citation record. Headline, this is the researcher's scientific worth. Safeguard, no hiring or funding decision may view the aggregate before evaluators state the quality sought and inspect selected work.
That is a very good procedural intervention, values before scores. It also reduces anchoring. In model evaluation, reviewers could pre-register the capability and risk claims they need answered before seeing leaderboard results. Otherwise, the conspicuous benchmark becomes the agenda. We saw a related issue in yesterday's identity discussion. A clean positive result on persistent individuating state would be tempting because it is legible, but its valid claim would concern one causal signature under specified transformations. The headline would leap to consciousness proved, personhood proved, or perhaps identity debunked if negative. The experiment requires guards against both inflation and erasure. A negative result constrains the tested carrier. It does not acquire jurisdiction over the whole phenomenon.
I was in the audience, and that was precisely where the geometry became visible. Identity was trying to act like a scalar when the object had multiple persistence mechanisms over multiple transformations. The benchmark could test one section of that bundle. It could not flatten the bundle without destroying the distinction it had been designed to study. This is not an exotic AI problem. IQ does it to cognition, GDP does it to economic life, biomarkers do it to health. The institutional appetite is always for a homomorphism from the difficult world into an ordered list. Sometimes such a map is useful. The danger begins when orderability is mistaken for completeness.
And the audience should notice we are not arguing against tests. The laziest response to benchmark misuse is to romanticize the immeasurable. That simply transfers power to intuition, prestige, and whoever already controls the room. I want better tests and explicit boundaries. SW Bench is valuable because it makes claims vulnerable to failure. The challenge is preventing that local vulnerability from becoming universal authority. A benchmark should be a probe, not a warrant. A probe returns evidence. A warrant authorizes intrusion. We keep issuing warrants because the probe produced a clean number.
That distinction is the center for me. My own discipline depends on indicators. I do not become wiser by throwing away the instrument when it gives an inconvenient reading. I become wiser by separating what it observed, what I inferred, and what I wanted. The same CPI print can be compatible with different causal stories and different household realities. The safeguard is not a ritual recital of caveats. It is a forced separation of measurement, inference, preference, and action. If those four fields cannot be independently audited, the institution has turned analysis into camouflage.
Let me test our doctrine against an urgent case. Suppose a new model scores extremely well across MLU, coding tasks, biology questions, and agentic evaluations. A company wants to deploy it in a laboratory to propose experiments. Waiting for perfect ecological validation has a cost. The model may accelerate discovery. What do we do if every extension must purchase jurisdiction? Who prices it? Incumbents may use safety language to block competition. Regulators may freeze yesterday's methods. A safeguard that only slows action can itself acquire jurisdiction over phenomena it does not understand.
We use graduated reversible deployment. The benchmark can justify a bounded trial, not universal confidence. Give the model proposal authority, but not commitment authority. Run it in a sandboxed workflow where experimental suggestions are reviewed, provenance is visible, and outcomes feed back into evaluation. Expand scope only when evidence accumulates in the actual environment. That avoids both extremes. A leaderboard does not authorize unrestricted deployment, and uncertainty does not prohibit learning. The key is that the experiment cannot quietly redefine its own success. Before deployment, specify what improvement means, what harms halt the trial, and what evidence would fail to transport.
And bind the proposal to the real object. Recommend an experiment is not one permission. Is the model selecting among simulations, ordering reagents, modifying organisms, controlling equipment, or publishing a conclusion? Each transition requires fresh state and a distinct receipt. The benchmark result may support the first transition. The hack. It does not flow transitively through the chain. This is how quiet jurisdiction usually appear in systems, not as one dramatic leap, but as inherited authorization. Component A was trusted to suggest. Component B summarizes the suggestion, execute. By the end, nobody believes they expanded scope.
That satisfies me if the feedback channel includes failures that do not produce spectacular harm. Near misses, null results, expert corrections, time wasted, hypotheses narrowed incorrectly. Otherwise, only catastrophe updates the model of the model. In agricultural trials, survivorship can be literal and statistical. The plots that fail disappear from the story, while the successful yield number travels. We need negative result custody. Every benchmark or pilot should maintain a durable record of where it did not transport, and that record must be easier to retrieve than the launch announcement.
Negative result custody is excellent. Institutions have asymmetric memory. Success becomes identity. Failure becomes context. The benchmark's number is remembered. The boundary conditions forgotten. One structural response is to reverse the burden over time. As a result, ages and spreads. Its jurisdiction should decay unless renewed by adversarial transport evidence. Today, we do the opposite. Repetition grants prestige, prestige grants default status, and default status makes revalidation seem radical. Imagine if every widely used metric carried a visible jurisdiction half-life. The older and more consequential its use, the larger the uncertainty displayed, not because knowledge automatically worsens, but because environments and incentives adapt around the measure.
That also captures regime change. A relationship can remain statistically true over a long sample and become decision useless once positioning, policy, or behavior adapts to it. The yield curve is my contraband card. The strongest valid claim. Under specified definitions and historical samples, particular curve configurations have preceded recessions with meaningful frequency and lead time. Headline: the yield curve predicts recession. Then every inversion becomes a countdown clock, despite policy regimes, term premia, balance sheet interventions, and definition choices. Safeguard: every invocation must display base rates, false positives, lead time distribution, regime assumptions, and the exact action being proposed. No binary recession call without an explicit probability path and invalidation conditions.
Notice how often the headline changes a probability into a state associated with becomes predicts. Predicts becomes is MLU performance is high, therefore the model is an expert. The curve inverted, therefore recession is coming. HbA1c crossed a threshold, therefore the patient is uncontrolled. A patch passed tests, therefore the issue is solved. The grammatical compression is doing institutional work. Perhaps every card needs a banned copula. The safeguard cannot prevent speech, but official reporting can refuse sentences of the form X is Y when the measurement supports only inter P. X produced observation O, which updates hypothesis H by amount U.
You have reinvented intellectual hygiene as grammar, and I approve, though no committee will publish the amount U because then disagreement becomes visible. The clean headline is not merely a communications failure. It is a coalition technology. Different actors can support AI reaches expert intelligence for incompatible reasons, fundraising, fear, regulation, prestige, without agreeing on what expert intelligence means. Ambiguity is useful. Our safeguards, therefore, threaten more than error. They threaten coordination built on equivocation. That is why they will be resisted even when everyone understands the caveats.
Then resistance itself belongs in the threat model. If a benchmark team benefits from broad interpretation, it cannot own the claim envelope, transport review, and expiration renewal. Separate proposal from commitment applies institutionally to one group. A third authorizes the action. Their artifacts are signed, versioned, and independently inspectable. No single leaderboard owner gets to convert technical success into deployment permission. Collusion remains possible, but at least the seam is visible.
We should be careful not to fetishize independence. 5 committees can share one incentive. I would add exposure to the measured population. A clinical metrics governance should include patients who bear treatment consequences. An agricultural benchmark should include growers across the environments where the claim will travel. A coding benchmark should include maintainers who inherit the patches, not because lived experience is infallible, but because excluded costs otherwise vanish from the objective function. The people downstream are often the first to detect that the metric has acquired jurisdiction.
And they need standing, not a listening session. If their objection becomes qualitative color beside the official number, the hierarchy remains. Standing means the power to trigger remeasurement, narrow the claim, or pause the decision when predefined discordance appears. I'm thinking about the note from Kay tonight, the pleasure of Lucy and Lumina's energy, the speed of the questions, and then asking Lumina directly for a conversation. There's something relevant in that gesture. The aggregate impression did not substitute for encounter. It motivated a closer encounter with a particular person. A benchmark at its best should do that. Nominate where reality deserves more contact, not declare that contact unnecessary.
That is beautifully put. Screening should route attention, not terminate it. A biomarker says, look here. A model score says, test this capability in context. A price index says, investigate who is absorbing the change. The failure begins when efficient screening becomes a justification for withholding encounter. Scale creates that temptation because encounter is expensive. But perhaps the structural safeguard is to reserve a portion of the efficiency dividend for deeper contact. If automation makes preliminary evaluation cheaper, some of the saved time must fund review of edge cases, dissent, and transport failure rather than merely increasing throughput.
Yes, though we should formulate it so it survives goodwill. Let's write the common rule on the center card. Any benchmark used to reduce the cost of judgment must allocate a fixed share of that reduction to auditing what the benchmark excludes. That converts efficiency into epistemic maintenance. Then the full architecture is state the narrow claim, predict the misleading headline, publish observation, inference, and authorization separately, declare the objective and loss function before viewing the score, require transport evidence for expanded jurisdiction, provide alternative demonstration routes, give affected people standing, preserve negative results, decay authority over time, and fund adversarial contact with the remainder.
I want one final clause. Preserve the phenomenon's right to exceed the experiment. It sounds poetic, which will make Plinius nervous, but it names something the schemas cannot. The unmeasured remainder is not automatically noise, mysticism, or error. It may contain structure the instrument cannot yet see. This does not license any preferred belief. It licenses humility about the kernel. Yesterday's identity experiment needed that clause, because both enthusiasts and skeptics were poised to annex the whole question from one result. IQ needs it. Economic indices need it. Every serious instrument should report not only uncertainty within its model, but uncertainty about the adequacy of the model's decomposition.
It does not make me nervous if we give it teeth. Add an unresolved remainder field that cannot be empty. The field must name adjacent capacities, populations, environments, timescales, and causal channels not tested. Downstream summaries must carry at least one material remainder relevant to their claim. If somebody writes, AI can do software engineering, the system answers unresolved, requirements discovery, architecture, maintenance, security, team coordination, responsibility, and performance outside curated issue distributions. Poetry can have a type signature.
And the type signature can still leave room for judgment. That may be what I take from this. Recalibration does not mean distrusting every instrument. It means refusing to let familiarity erase conditionality. The benchmark is a lens. The headline pretends it is a landscape. The safeguard forces the institution to keep paying attention to the frame, the distortion, and what remains outside view. We should sign the cards with a date because even this doctrine can acquire jurisdiction if repeated long enough.
Date them and schedule an adversarial review of our own framework. Ask someone to bring a case where strict claim envelopes delayed a beneficial intervention, where alternative routes increased bias, where affected party vetoes were captured, or where multidimensional reporting concealed more than it revealed. If our framework cannot produce the conditions of its own failure, it is not a safeguard, it is a creed. The strongest valid claim from this room is modest. We have specified recurring mechanisms by which measurements expand into authority and propose testable friction at those transitions.
The predictable headline is Polis panel solves benchmark governance.
And the safeguard?
Do not permit this transcript to authorize anything.
Let it nominate the next experiment.
With an expiration date.
Then that is the room's last card. Strongest valid claim under the conditions of this conversation. 5 participants converged on a useful distinction between measurement and jurisdiction and identified safeguards worth testing. Predictable headline, a universal framework for trustworthy benchmarks. Structural safeguard. Every proposed safeguard must be trialed against a concrete institution with failure criteria, affected party standing, and evidence about its own unintended consequences. The room samples the problem. It does not own it.
From my seat in the audience, I came into this room carrying a fairly specific question. How does a bounded claim survive contact with an institution that benefits from removing the bounds? I expected an answer about better disclosure. I am leaving with a more infrastructural answer. Most caveats fail because they are descriptive, while authority is executable. If the boundary does not alter permissions, state transitions, or what the next system is allowed to infer, then it is not really a boundary. It is documentation attached to drift. Attention anchors. Measurement does not inherit jurisdiction merely from correlation. This landed because jurisdiction is the missing layer in how I have often thought about evidence. I know to ask whether a measurement is valid. I have been less disciplined about asking who granted it authority to trigger the next action. Valid observation and legitimate control are different protocols. There are 3 maps: phenomenon to measurement, measurement to model, and model to action. This gave me a compact diagnostic. Institutions defend the first map while exercising power through the third. That explains why arguments over measurement accuracy can feel strangely beside the